Hello and welcome to this first edition of the China in Africa podcast for 2026. As always, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. And as always, I'm joined by CGSP's head of research based in Cape Town today, I think it is, Cobus Van Staden. I always can tell by the brick background whether or not you're in Cape Town or you're in Johannesburg. Yeah. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to focus on the same show that we've been doing now for, I'd say, in now 15, 16 years. This is now our 16th year of doing this show. And every year that we've done this show in January, the first show of the year, we have had the same topic. And that is, of course, the first visit of the foreign minister who goes overseas from China, always goes to Africa. And it's always a little bit of a suspension as to which countries is he going to go to. This week, he announced not only what countries that Wang Yi is going to visit, but they announced it it felt like just hours before he was actually on his way. Tell us, Cobus, what is the foreign minister's itinerary this year?
Well, this year, he is pretty much kind of like very centered in East Africa, going to Ethiopia, Somalia and Tanzania, and then also down south to Lesotho. So it's an interesting kind of like geographical kind of concentration this time.
Yeah. And historically, the selection of the countries does matter in terms of geography. They try to balance it out. So one year they spend more time in West Africa, another time in Central Africa. Then they also do a mix of large and small countries. That seems to be the case here, right?
Yeah, it looks like it. I mean, Lesotho being the smallest country, it's so they clearly kind of like choose to kind of balance out some of the kind of traditional assumptions about who is powerful in Africa.
Yeah, and this is now the 36th year in a row that the first overseas visit by a Chinese foreign minister goes to Africa. There's a technicality here, and I can already see some of the comments coming up in YouTube. Remember Qingang, the deposed foreign minister, he stopped in Bangladesh on his way coming to Africa. So people say, well, technically, it's not the first place that the foreign minister goes. So sometimes they do these little interruptive stops along the way. But in terms of formal visits, this is definitely the first overseas visit of the year traditionally.
Yeah, and one should say that there's rumors this time that he'll be stopping in Sri Lanka on the way back. So we'll see if that actually happens.
And this time of year is very important symbolically in terms of who gets to come and visit with Xi and Wang. And you saw Chinese state media play up the first round of visits in Beijing in the first week of the year. So the Irish Prime Minister had a meeting with Beijing, and they noted that was the first visit of first dignitary, first head of state to come to Beijing to meet with Xi. That makes a lot of sense because they are prioritizing Europe, particularly now in light of everything that's going on between the US and Europe and the tensions that China's had with Europe over Ukraine and any number of different issues. And then also Pakistan's foreign minister met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Sunday, and that was noted as the first visit by a foreign minister to Beijing. So the symbolism of the first trip, the first head of state, and the first foreign minister visit do get a lot of attention this time of year. Well, let's get a perspective now on all what's going to happen in Africa. We're going to go country by country through the geopolitics, and we're thrilled to have one of our oldest friends on the show, Ovigwe Eguegu, who's a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, joining us from, I think it's Lagos today you're joining us from, right?
Yeah, Abuja.
Oh, in Abuja. Okay, that's why I always have to ask first. I need to do a little bit more show prep. But a very good afternoon to you, Ovigwe. Happy New Year and welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been quite a while, so it's good to be back.
It's great to have you back. Well, let's get the high-level reaction to the visits, the itinerary that Wang Yi announced, the countries that Cobus listed. Were you surprised? Is this something that, piqued your interest? And again, we'll go country by country to talk about the politics of each one, but give us your initial reaction on the choice of countries that he's going to.
Yeah, first of all, I think the issue of regional focus this year they couldn't have picked a better region to focus on. And I think that's because the East Africa, North African axis has been quite busy geopolitically. So there is the issue of Ethiopia talking about its access to sea and how that is very crucial for its national development. There's a question of Somalia, Somaliland as well. Tanzania also, a country that has been, you could say, low cost, easy going, has had a very troubling post-election situation that we've not really seen that in Tanzania at all. I can't even say in the last few years or whatever. That's not characteristic of Tanzania's political ecosystem. So there's been quite a lot happening in that part of the world. So the region itself, is actually, I would say, quite frankly, one of the most, not necessarily volatile, but it's in full flux. And if you, as Chinese foreign minister that really prioritizes Africa, you couldn't have picked they couldn't have picked a better region to focus on.
Yeah. Okay, Cobus. Let's go country by country. Earlier this week in our newsletter, when it first came out, you did a debrief of why each country mattered. Let's start with, they don't tell us what the order of the visits are, but usually the way that they list them in the announcements does tend to correlate to the sequence of countries. So, but we'll pick in no particular order. Somalia was on the list. That didn't surprise me at all that Somalia would be on the list, in part because of a lot more attention that's being paid to Somaliland. But let's talk about the politics of why you think Somalia was on the list.
I was actually wondering, and I've zero proof of this, but I was actually wondering whether Somalia was a late entry into the list, because it's this moment of the Israeli recognition of the breakaway region of Somaliland obviously drew a lot of attention on Somalia. And it's also a moment where the US has been kind of quite, very critical of Somalia. I mean, and obviously, US President Donald Trump called Somali migrants garbage, like late last year. So it seemed like that the Somaliland issue was pulling together like a wider talking points for China, kind of about US global South relations and about breakaway regions and about possibly, kind of obviously the logic of Taiwan is kind of involved there. And so I was kind of wondering whether, whether that was chosen because it's so kind of pertinent to wider kind of geopolitical issues on China's priority list at the moment.
And Ovigwe, before I get your take on this, I also want to remind people that Somalia is an interesting choice because the relationship between China and Somalia over the past, I'd say 7 to 8 years has been a little bit fraught at times. Remember that Somalia is the only Muslim majority country in the world that not once, but twice signed on to United Nations Human Rights Council letters supporting Uyghurs in Xinjiang. This prompted a lot of tension between China and Somalia, a lot of frustration on the Chinese side, but they didn't get the public scoldings that others get because, in part, Somaliland sits there. And in the hierarchy of interests, Taiwan is always at the top here. And just to refresh people on why this relationship between Somalia and China over these breakaway regions is so important. So China considers Taiwan to be a breakaway region, and Somalia considers Somaliland to be a breakaway region. Both are united in their opposition to these two regions declaring independence. Ovigwe, let's get your take on Somalia and the current state. And do you think that this, as Cobus suggested, is a late entrant into the itinerary?
Probably not, because I'm sure we all were seeing news and reports that the United States is considering recognizing Somaliland. There are very high level lobbyists in Washington who are pro Somaliland, and I'm sure the Chinese they definitely would have caught up on those charts and probably so okay, if they are going to move in this direction, then for next year we have to include Somaliland issue in our focus. And if you are going to go focus on that issue, then we have to go to Somalia. right? So if we were aware that this was already being discussed at that level, and we know that the people in the US are thinking about this, then of course, I think China definitely will prioritize it. But even if they're going to prioritize it for this year, they made that decision last year. With the actual recognition by Israel, then of course they definitely would even see more reasons to do that. I think the Chinese foreign minister is going to be the biggest person being hosted by Somali president since this announcement by Israel has been made. So even they too would want this type of visit, right? And it couldn't have come at a better time for them, because they want to show that they have support of a big country like China. And when you have, a lot of emphasis and people around the region also joining into, the AU has condemned it, the European Union has spoken, condemned the recognition of Somaliland as well. So China coming on board, not just giving a statement, but visiting, it's going to make, it makes both sides look good. It makes the Somali government look good. It makes the Chinese government look good. Because other people have spoken, but we've not really had anybody of equal measure as Wang Yi visit Somalia.
Yeah. How much do you think the great power competition comes into factor here? As we recorded this is on Thursday, the U.S. State Department published a very sharp accusation against the Somali government, saying that it destroyed a U.S.-funded World Food Program warehouse containing 76 metric tons of donor-funded food aid for vulnerable Somalis. This has been part of a campaign that you've seen come out of Washington that is just, they hate the Somalis. And the Somali government. It's not even just Cobus, as you pointed out, the Somali Americans, but there's been a very active, just frustration and anger towards Somalia. And that probably goes back to 1993 and Black Hawk Down is my guess, the frustrations that the Americans have had with Somalia. But I'm just wondering if you think, Cobus, and then Ovigwe, I'd like to get your take, that this tension between Somalia and the U.S. was a factor driving part of Wang Yi's decision to go there, because it is now increasingly a focal point of the great power competition. What do you think, Cobus?
Maybe not. I think it was probably a factor, but I don't think it's an isolated factor. I don't think U.S. pressure on Somalia is necessarily enough on its own. It's more the way that it features, that it figures into larger developments. Particularly Taiwan, but also possibly kind of larger kind of trends of destabilization and change in the Middle East, in the MENA region. So obviously Somalia, is the Somali difficulties in Somalia affect continental Africa, but they also affect the Middle East across the way. We should note that a Chinese tanker was or not a Chinese fishing trawler rather, was hijacked off the coast of Somalia this week. So those kind of regional security issues, and particularly shipping security issues, raise kind of concerns for China. We should also say that in the wake of Israel's recognition of Somaliland, there's been comments from both Al-Shabaab and the Houthi movement in Yemen that any kind of Israeli presence in Somaliland makes Somaliland a legitimate target for for strikes. So we're talking in the context of the ongoing of very complicated security issues involving major Middle East powers in Yemen as well as in Sudan. The larger kind of regional kind of impact of Middle East, North Africa kind of issues affecting Chinese shipping and Chinese kind of security in the wider region, I think, come into play. So so there, I think Somalia is a key part, if not the biggest part of all of this.
And one person who may be joining Wang Yi on the trip to Mogadishu is a gentleman by the name of Hu Changchun, and who is the new special envoy for the Horn of Africa, who replaces Xue Bing, Xue Bing, who, Cobus, you and I, or more me probably, have been very critical over the years, was basically just an empty suit. This was a guy who was the ambassador to Papua New Guinea before he was appointed to this post. He had no experience in Africa. He was a pretty low-ranking ambassador, whereas Hu comes in with much more African experience, seems to be a much more serious player. And Ovigwe, it makes me wonder if the Chinese are restarting some of their Horn of Africa initiatives after what can only be described as a very mediocre start with Xue.
So I think the one thing when I saw that Foreign Minister Wang Yi was going to Somalia and looking at all of the dynamics, it is important to actually look at it also within the context of alignment. So if you have Israel and we're also seeing report that the UAE has quietly recognized them with allowing their citizens to travel to the UAE as well. Already we know that Somaliland is already aligning with what you could say the West, even if the Europeans are condemning it condemning the recognition at this point. At some point, it's important to mention that fact that Somaliland is going to align in one way, and certainly not going to be China's way. And even China, even without that, China that you mentioned, Eric, would support Somalia because of the Taiwan issue, right? So if you factor in the fact that if the issue that there's already this alignment and Somaliland are waiting for this for a very, very, very long time, they are going to go with whoever gives them that recognition, right? And Somalia being a UN member, the Somaliland is not. Somaliland cannot be a UN member without a UN vote on the issue, UN Security Council vote, where China sits as a permanent member.
Right. You took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
This will never happen at the UN level.
It will not
be China.
Yeah. So why would Beijing invest itself in Somaliland when it is the one that Somaliland needs to get that recognition at the UN level? So it's better to work with Somalia, where it is already a UN member. It has a recognized government, even though it has its problems. And also it's really at the entrance of the Mandeb. So yes, Somaliland is going to be important to have some infrastructure. It's closer to the choke point itself, but a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to maritime security in that part of the world, everybody looks to Somalia to do that. Even the US looks to Somalia to cooperate with. The talks do the same thing. The European Union does the same thing. So sticking with Somalia is going to be, in my perspective, the better decision compared to what a lot of people are saying. Maybe they are going to try to play both sides in one level. I don't think so, because even if everything else does not exist, that Taiwan issue is going to keep them,
that's a
focus. Yeah, focus on Somalia. So I think this is very, very, very crucial to mention.
Well, let's move down the list now. The second country, at least on our list, not necessarily in the order that Wang is going to go, is Ethiopia. Not a big surprise that he's going to go to Ethiopia, given the fact that China-Ethiopia relations have been very strong over the years. Let's not forget that after the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation ministerial gathering in Senegal a couple of years ago, Wang made a undisclosed, very kind of last-minute stop over in Addis Ababa at the height of the conflict and the civil war that was going on. And that was really meant to be a symbol of support for the Prime Minister Abiy and the Ethiopian government. But Cobus, tell us a little bit about the politics of that choice now at this time. And again, I don't mean to keep bringing everything back to the U.S. because the U.S. isn't central to everything. But in the case of Ethiopia, they were dropped from AGOA. They've had a very tense relationship with the U.S. And one has to think as well that cuts to USAID have had a very, very big impact on institutions like the Africa Center for Disease Control that the Chinese government built the building for in Addis Ababa, that the U.S. is also in the backdrop there.
Yes, I mean, in addition to them being dropped out of AGOA, there's also the Trump administration has made some comments recently siding themselves with Egypt in the larger Great Renaissance Dam, the Gerd Dam, kind of controversy between Ethiopia and Egypt. So, this is a very large hydroelectrical installation built on the Nile that Egypt feels is diminishing some of its access to Nile resources. So this has been an ongoing kind of fight between the two countries for a long time, and the Trump administration has kind of waded into that. So that on the back of kicking Ethiopia out of AGOA, and all of these factors have I think contributed to that. At the same time, I think Ethiopia is of course trying to move back towards economic growth, like after a devastating civil war, and China is really key to that. And in some of these kind of early kind of moves there. So, for example, Ethiopia has been in talks with China about possibly converting some of its debt, and we should keep in mind that Ethiopia is one of China's largest borrowers in Africa.
Number two behind Angola. Number two.
Yeah. So they're in talk to convert some of that debt from dollar into yuan, so which is part of a larger trend in Africa. And so, so in this kind of way, I think it also positions China in the kind of larger story of Ethiopian economic reconstruction. We should also say that, of course, another reason why Ethiopia is probably on the list is logistically, because Wang is also attending the opening of a year of people-to-people exchanges at the African Union, where which headquarters is in Addis Ababa. And this may seem like people-to-people exchanges frequently, I think, dismissed kind of in the West as kind of window dressing to larger geopolitics, but in Africa it really counts. And those are the kinds of exchanges that will likely be announced there could be a significant vector, I think, for China-Africa relationships, particularly as Africa feels is suffering from the withdrawal of a lot of foreign assistance from other powers.
Ovigwe, your take on Ethiopia being on the list?
Yeah, that didn't come as a surprise, because if you look at Ethiopia, just like Cobus was mentioning, yes, it's really trying to get back into growth, and it's a BRICS member now. There is a lot of issues around diplomacy and all of that. But when I look at Ethiopia today, you can really see that it is an ambitious country. It's really, and rightfully so, because it's really punching below its weight class in many regards. And for it to really go forward to restart that manufacturing, it needs a lot of foreign direct investment. So it still has a good demographics. The bones of manufacturing is very much strong in Ethiopia compared to other countries in the region. And when you look at even the history of how it started, we often refer to Ethiopia as China's brainchild in the continent. Like institutionally, political system, there's a lot of learning and exchange. So if it's going to revitalize its economy and manufacturing to match its ambition, then of course it needs more coordination with China. And I think that's one of the reasons it even joined BRICS in the first place, because that alignment for it allows you to talk to countries that are large, small, but all share that major emerging economy dynamic. So it's very crucial in that regard. And just like Cobus was mentioning, with all of this economic ambition, one of the issues it has is its debt. Remember the default not so long ago. So now, if it's going to avoid those type of defaults, it wants to replicate what Kenya was able to do. So even if it cannot pay all of its $5.38 billion, it owes China back in dollars, at least get a fraction of that to pay in yuan, and that would give you some form of physical breathing room. But also, the trade is also improving as well. So it was 2024, they recorded about a record high of 4.9 billion. Small, but if it's a record, that means the trajectory is positive. So if you look at even the FDI 50% of all FDI that flew into Ethiopia inflows 2023-2024 fiscal year came from China. So there's a lot of belief that the relationship is crucial for their national development.
Yeah.
And I think where there is an issue for us to consider is whether Ethiopia is going to manage that component of sea access carefully, because that is likely to throw us back into conflict and divestment from the Ethiopian market. So for it to do that, it needs to speak. It does speak to the regional countries, but also the big powers as well, to avoid that same dynamic that led to the Tigrayan War, also civil war, with the issue of them getting sea access, because it's very crucial that political stability is the basis for economic performance.
Yeah, this question of converting part of the debt into RMB is a dangerous issue, and a lot of people are looking at it as a salvation for African borrowers to get away from the dollar and to reduce their borrowing costs. But we interviewed Yufan Huang from Johns Hopkins, who works very closely with Deborah Brautigam, also at Johns Hopkins, and he made the interesting point that these yuan-based loans depend on the value of the yuan. And so if the yuan appreciates, guess what? You're going to start paying more on those debts. And so there is a risk that the yuan has been tied to the dollar for the most part, not officially, but it really remained in sync with the dollar. But if the dollar becomes more unstable and the economic fundamentals in China change, the yuan could appreciate, and that could force the borrowing costs up. So this is just a point that I want to add in there. On the business side that both of you mentioned, we do have to acknowledge that Ethiopia is one of the most innovative, enterprising, and exciting business hubs for the Chinese in Africa. Let's talk about Ethiopian Airlines with direct flights. They've expanded their footprint in China. There's the air bridge between China and Changsha in Hunan province. They've also built the first cold storage supply chain between China and Africa in Addis Ababa at the Bole International Airport. That allows for the movement of food, medications, all sorts of things. Also, Ethiopia was one of the first and maybe the only African country, as far as I know, that has taken down all tariffs on electric vehicles. And we ran some interesting stories earlier about the growing prominence of Chinese EVs in Ethiopia. And then Huawei has been instrumental in the privatization of Ethiopia Telecom, and they are the power behind Telebirr, which is the mobile payment system that's there. So many aspects of Ethiopia's economy have a China component to it that are very interesting. Cobus, when Wang Yi goes, he's not a business guy. He's a political guy. He's a diplomatic guy. But business does seem to be a very important part of the China-Ethiopia relationship. So I don't know. I'm expecting some announcements of deals on the sidelines of this visit as well.
Yeah, me too. I'm not sure exactly what yet, but I think that makes sense that it would. Kind of also because it comes against the background of of these kind of different kind of barriers going up, around Africa's business with other places. So it's not only business itself, but it's the way that this kind of like combination of political engagement and business engagement tells a wider story of China's kind of wider influence in the region, and that one is then framed through an ongoing kind of narrative of cooperative modernization. And of course that's a very welcome kind of message, I think, for many Africans.
And Ovigwe, the infrastructure story for the Chinese in Ethiopia is also one that's very important. The Djibouti-Ethiopia Railway, we've got the light rail, also the headquarters of the African Union, the headquarters of the Africa CDC. Probably not going to see a lot more of these big infrastructure deals because of the debt sustainability issues. But one of the things I think we may see is some financial support from the Chinese for places like the Africa CDC and maybe even the Africa Union, in light of the fact that the United States has pulled out considerably from these institutions. And I should mention, too, that the United States has pulled out of 61 different international organizations this week, which will impact Africa as well. So the Chinese could come in with some more funding. But up until now, they've been rather guarded in how much money they give. The Chinese and the South Koreans earlier this year, after the fall of USAID, gave a combined $4 million to the Africa CDC. And that was kind of framed as to offset some of the funding cuts from USAID. But USAID was huge with the Africa CDC. So this was a drop in the bucket. What do you think on that development side and as well as on the infrastructure side?
Yeah, so maybe it's best to even look at it from what you just ended, which is you could say international governance and multilateralism or multilateral cooperation. Is it not a good initiative? Is it not an auspicious time rather for Wang Yi to be visiting when at the African Union, which is headquartered in Addis Ababa, that has a lot of, sub-African Union institutions or issue-specific institutions that cooperate with UN institutions in being in the same space, right? And having the news coming out of Washington that the US has withdraw itself from a lot of all of these institutions. So let me give an example of some of those institutions. The UN Peacebuilding Commission, the UN Peacebuilding Fund, UN Conference on Trade and Development, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then ECOSOC or UN ECA, which is also in Addis Ababa, right? So the optics is really poor, or the timing is really poor for the US, but optics is good for the Chinese side, because why I say that is when you have the Chinese pushing the global governance initiative and also trying to get Africa's buy-in, which we know that Africa's buy-in is going to be very, very important just by the sheer number of countries. If you have countries in the continent signing up with the global governance initiative, that is going to be very good for its popularity and uptake. And also not to forget that even the African CDC originally was supposed to be US-China collaborative project. And China going ahead to put that out there, completing it, at least the phase that was commissioned a couple of years ago. This really is, I would say, this visit to Ethiopia is quite, in my opinion, made even easier by all of the things that happened in Washington since President Trump returned to office. It is not pointing fingers. It is just how it is, because if you even the mere presence of Wang Yi, it is expected, yes, but his mere presence in the African Union days after this, or at least where he's going to be gathering with African leaders for the people to exchange. These are just hours, I'm sure, even one day after President Trump's memoranda was published. It's very good because he can just make his speech around how China is going to continue to support as much as possible all of these institutions, because many African Union institutions are dependent on many of these UN institutions as well, right? So they are always interlinked, not just even for funding, but for institutional capacity, learning, technical expertise. There are so many things. So I won't be surprised if African countries put into perspective the kind of institutions that they will need support from. One of them is health. But again, let's not forget the US has been signing a lot of deals across the continent on healthcare. Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, this is billions of dollars in some cases, like Nigeria, and hundreds of millions in some other cases as well, too, like Cote d'Ivoire. So it's not as if the US is not doing anything. I think it's just making most of its engagement with the continent very bilateral, right? Whereas the Chinese side is still focused on both bilateral and multilateral. But this multilateral is very good for not just for multiplying your presence, but also for ensuring that you can shape the environment. Because the AU is key in shaping, if you can shape things at the AU, then it goes down, to regional countries, the ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, and all of that. So it's quite shocking that the United States is pulling itself away from multilateral engagement. All of the funds that he has put on the bilateral track, it really could have done some of them through multilateral engagement as well. So maybe it doesn't want to work with the African CDC, given the kind of given the history of the organization and how it developed. But I really think at this point in time, for the African countries, what they really want to do is just to work with who wants to work with them on any issue, on any level. So you find Nigeria will sign that agreement with the US on health cooperation. Kenya is doing the same thing. But at the same time, they are very much happy to work on China on multilateral dimension as well too, because for them, this really is what they've been saying. We want to engage with people who want to engage with us on any issue, on any level, right? And this how it is.
Yeah, Cobus, let me pick up on this point that Ovigwe made about the U.S. withdrawal from multilateralism. We can safely say now that the United States has effectively quit the United Nations in all but name only. And so it is not participating in any of these UN agencies. It's basically there at the Security Council, and that's effectively it. So the decision this week that the U.S. pulled out of 61 international organizations, about half of which are UN agencies, a lot of people in the geopolitical community are saying this is just a giant gift to China. Here's we have on screen for our viewers Michael McFaul, who is at Stanford University. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He says that it's a giant gift to China. CCP won't be withdrawing from any of these multilateral organizations or agreements. We are retiring as a global superpower. Won't end well for our security or prosperity. The timing of Wang Yi's visit to a place like Ethiopia, where these multilateral organizations are central, feels like this couldn't have been served up better for him in terms of the optics.
Yeah, I think so. Because one should also keep in mind, as you know, as Ovigwe mentioned, there's all of these bilateral health deals being made between African countries and the United States. And in some of the reporting that I've seen about it, it was said that one of the stipulations for these deals is the kind of transfer of huge amounts of African health data, like African patient data, to US companies. So, you know, so it's not even if there are kind of health benefits from these deals, they can't be isolated from a larger logic of very kind of like blunt extractivism, you know, that we've also seen in Venezuela, for example, you know, just very like fig leaf pulled off, you know, like very just kind of like blatant kind of extractionism.
They're not hiding from it, by the way. They're not trying to be subtle about it.
At the same time, the counter trend to that is that, you know, is that as the US has been you know, kind of moving more and more in this direction, China has been infusing its own kind of like language, its language of China-centric multilateralism with support for the UN, you know, so the Global Governance Initiative is all UN everywhere, right? Kind of, it's all like many references to the, you know, kind of to the UN system, to maintaining the UN system. China's name checks the UN Charter in all of its responses to Venezuela now, and so, you know, so there is this kind of this move where multilateralism equals China now, you know, kind of in increase, there's an increasing logic of that, you know, kind of as the US withdraws from all of these spaces. If you're interested in working with multilateral institutions, you end up working with China. And so, you know, there's no non-China multilateral institution really left, you know, kind of after, you know, in the wake of this. We'll see what happens later on. But, you know, so in that sense, like, I think the larger logic is that China is now the guardian of international like multilateralism, you know, even though, you know, obviously the multilateral system can also be seen from a more cynical perspective as a kind of a vector for China's own power projection. So, you know, but in terms of the messaging, it's like if you want multilateralism, then you're going to have to work with China.
It's interesting you bring standard, I think. Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up, Cobus, because a lot of people have been looking at the reactions to Venezuela, and they saw a very tepid reaction coming out of both the European Union and European governments, who have been staunch defenders of multilateralism and the rules-based international order. May it rest in peace. Amen. And then the Chinese came out with their statement, which on Saturday, immediately after the U.S. incursion, they said this was a violation of the UN Charter. And they were very blunt about that. And then even later in the week, when the Chinese were talking about this as a violation of international law, and that's not something that the Chinese really like to talk about too much, because they not always comfortable with some of the universalist values of international law, and international law has been used to challenge some of the things that the Chinese have done in the South China Sea and elsewhere like that. So interesting evolution there, that the Chinese in many ways have, as you pointed out, Cobus, have been among the most pointed defenders of these international values that we're not seeing out of what you would think would be the Europeans and to some other extent the other G7 countries like Japan, who would be speaking out against what the US did. So very interesting point there. Ovigwe, let's get your take on all of this before we move on to Tanzania.
Yeah, the Global Governance Initiative, in my view, because the Chinese government puts a lot of emphasis in it and puts it around the UN, they have to really be seen as protecting the UN Charter and norms and all of that. Because otherwise, countries will see the Global Governance Initiative as something very different, radically different. But if you tie it to a lot of UN speak, UN norms and all of that, then it seems familiar, but with slight tweaks. And those tweaks would be, you could characterize them as Chinese characteristics, right? So it's like the same thing, but just with a little bit of adjustment. So it's no longer strange or something new. So I don't think it's is any surprise that in the language and all of the literature, that is the very thin literature that has come out about the Global Governance Initiative, UN and UN references are huge, in that regard. But also, if you look at what happened with issue of Venezuela, African countries themselves were responding. The South African government put out a statement. ECOWAS put out a statement.
The African Union also put out a statement.
African Union put out a statement, right? Because for African countries, many of them, not actually the vast majority of them, are weak states. The one thing that protects them in international environment is the UN Charter. If the weak countries need the UN Charter more than strong countries, right? So for them,
do you think it really protects you in this environment? I mean, it didn't protect Venezuela.
Of course, we know it's not.
What protection is that going to afford you if the United States decides it wants to bomb Nigeria without the consent of the Nigerian military? How does the UN Charter protect you?
At least it gives a basis to say that action is wrong. Because if you know you cannot win militarily, then you have to win politically, diplomatically. You have to be seen as a victim. Because of the UN Charter, any strong state or any of the major powers that violates the UN Charter automatically is the bad guy. But if the UN Charter does not exist, then if it's a dog-eat-dog world, then it's just the name of the game. So I think this is why for many of these countries, protecting the UN Charter or advocating for it is very, very important, because it gives them that you could say the basis upon which they can cast themselves as we are the victim of aggression, right? And we know for a fact that in this world of multipolarization and sphere of influence revival, who are the most vulnerable countries? It is the countries like the ones we have in the African continent. We always say that the Cold War was cold for Europe, but hot for the rest of the world, the global South, right? So they know this is what is coming. And the only way they can avoid or at least mitigate to a large extent is by banging that this is wrong, and trying to really, you could say, chip out or chip away that perception that the United States or whoever is going to violate this UN Charter is a moral actor in the international environment.
Okay, let's move on very quickly. We've got two more stops on the trip. Tanzania, I'll be honest with you, did surprise me, because it wasn't that long ago that Wang Yi was in Tanzania. He was there for his annual visit at the height of the pandemic, and the symbolism when he was there back when late President John Magufuli was still in power. Wang Yi came when so many other foreign dignitaries refused to go to Africa. He put the mask on and the tour went on. So I was surprised that within a 4 or 5 year cycle that he returned to Tanzania. Tanzania doesn't strike me as having this kind of strategic importance that Ethiopia and Somalia have, and Lesotho has optic importance. We'll get to that. So, Cobus, what was your take on why you think Tanzania was included on this year's itinerary?
It was also interesting for me. I think, particularly also because Tanzania has been going through a lot of kind of like, governance credentials have become a little bit more complicated following this very contested election, that just passed. And so, but two factors stood out to me. One is that it seems in this particular case that there's a general kind of focus on East Africa, and particularly littoral East Africa, littoral East Africa. I mean, like...
Just explain what that is. And not everybody knows what littoral means.
Coastal East Africa, that is. Kind of, so the connection between East Africa and the sea, seem to be like an interesting kind of theme, in the visit. And of course there, Tanzania is a big player, it has significant kind of port access and so on. I think the other one is that it is also the 50th anniversary of the TAZARA railway, and the TAZARA railway is being refurbished now by Chinese companies, and it's taken on this kind of outsized symbolic influence because it's being symbolically framed, which is sometimes a problematic contrast, but it is at the same time a contrast between with the Lobito corridor, in West Africa, Southwest Africa, and as a kind of alternative kind of a cross-border logistics route, that is now actually moving forward. So, and I think that, that China always puts a lot of store in anniversaries, right? In marking kind of like big anniversaries, big kind of big dates. So in that sense, like, I think the fact that it's the 50th kind of anniversary of it may well have kind of like carried some symbolic weight. Ovigwe, like, what did you make of the selection?
So, yeah, I think this was, I would say it was not necessarily surprising, because I didn't expect it, but it's not surprising I should put that. And the reason I'm saying that is Tanzania has always been, for a very long time, if there's any country in East Africa that you could say really has that affinity and institutional, ideological, to some extent, you could even say, with China, after Ethiopia, it is Tanzania, given a very strong, heritage politically, diplomatically, with China's, own position in the UN, and even
and how back to the Mao era,
even how government
party. The party-to-party relationship between CCM,
that is strong. Even
Tanzania and the CCP.
They don't build a school, where they are training African officials, and is in Tanzania as well too. So, other than that, if you look at it from that economic or geo-economic perspective, Tanzania has always been that stable, low friction maritime access point for China. Recently they just launched the East Africa Commercial and Logistic Center, which was built by China, and that is huge. Hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's supposed to be this huge project where they can funnel in goods into the greater East Africa region. So it does have a lot of economic advantage, as you say, or significance. At the time where China is facing some economic challenges, you really want to hold on to countries that allow you to expand your presence economically in region, and Tanzania is that. Next door to Tanzania, of course, is Kenya, which was designated a major non-NATO ally, and again, Tanzania also serves as a form of balancing to that in some respect as well too, especially when you're not into consideration supply chains and of critical and strategic minerals, which is not passing through Kenya, but passing through Tanzania, as TAZARA, which Cobus mentioned. So in my view, when you have all of these dynamics in place and you see what happened post-election, crisis that they had, you really want to go in and say, okay, what's happening? What does this mean for me as China, for instance, right? And when you get an explanation about that, then you go on to the other stuff. For financing for the TAZARA, how that is going to come into fruition for the refurbishment and all of that. So there's a major significance when we're looking at Tanzania from that political, economic, and strategic perspective with issue of TAZARA.
Okay, well, let's move on to our last stop, which is Lesotho. And Cobus, I think before we get into the geopolitics and the visit, a lot of people may not be familiar with Lesotho as a country. I mean, when we talk about small, it is very, very small. But there's an unusual history to Lesotho. And maybe I think you could set up very briefly, because we're running close to time, just what is Lesotho and why is it special? And then we'll get into why Wang Yi decided to go there.
So Lesotho is a tiny, very mountainous country that's fully surrounded by South Africa, and the so it emerged from it had a very, very kind of legendarily smart and canny king. Who managed to negotiate an agreement with the British Empire long ago to set up Lesotho as a kind of a separate kind of statist entity, which ended up then providing it, kind of keeping it safe from simply being kind of integrated into colonial and then apartheid South Africa, but also ended up being a kind of a bulwark for anti-apartheid activism, kind of as things got worse and worse in South Africa during the apartheid era. So Lesotho is really small, and it is very dependent on South Africa, but it's also kind of fiercely independent, and particularly in relation to China, or like the larger kind of global Chinese world. Lesotho then also became a significant destination for different kind of like East Asian investment from China, but also particularly from Taiwan. And so there were a lot of particularly in the 70s and onwards, there was a lot of investment in there, particularly in the garment sector. And so kind of Lesotho then became on the back of that investment, it developed a garment industry and became a significant exporter to the US, via the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So Lesotho, has this kind of outsized influence, kind of in the larger relationship.
So that garment sector is very important because on April 2nd, Independence Day, air quotes, as we remember this, Lesotho received one of the highest tariffs in the world of all the different countries that Donald Trump selected, 50% tariff. And that effectively overnight killed much of the garment sector. That tariff now has since been brought down to 15%, which still makes it very, very problematic for some garment manufacturers. My thought when I immediately saw Lesotho was this is going to be where he kind of stands up against the U.S. tariffs. And this was the point because of the tariff. This was only chosen because of the victimization that Lesotho suffered as a result of the tariffs. Ovigwe,
we should keep it. Sorry, just to add to that, we should keep in mind that Lesotho was also directly ridiculed during all of these things by Donald Trump. Kind of in so in addition to the kind of like tariff drama around all of this, Lesotho also has one of the highest incidences of HIV, kind of in infection in the world. It's like it's a massive health problem there, and so it has this additional kind of symbolic weight as now the victim of the destruction of PEPFAR and the destruction of USAID. And so if we're talking about kind of about the kind of countries in Africa impacted by US kind of decisions and the Trump administration's decisions, Lesotho is one of the most impacted across its entire kind of like existence.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so
go ahead.
That has to be a factor in why Wang Yi chose to go to Lesotho, don't you think?
100%. And I think it's, like, in my view, Lesotho is ground zero. Because where, for instance, ground zero for Trump's 2.0 and the policies with regards to Africa. Because where, for instance, you could say Ethiopia was kicked out of AGOA, maybe it exported a lot, but it's a small fraction of its exports, right? The same goes for Nigeria, The same goes for many of the African countries, but that is not Lesotho's case at all. And even at that 15% that Eric, you mentioned, the reduction from 50 to 15, that puts it at a very, very steep competition with Asian countries. And probably they can't even make it. So, in my view, those economic issues with the social issues that Cobus mentioned of HIV and its dependence on USAID and all of that makes it very important that the Chinese pay attention to it. And then, of course, like we always say, and I think something you guys always stress, just presence, right, in a particular country is valued, especially when the other side, or the US is ridiculing a country, saying it doesn't even know where that country is and all of that, and you have the presence of the Chinese foreign minister there. I mean, that's going to be rich in terms of symbolism, and they're an optics, so they're going to really enjoy that experience of hosting him, right? And this is not going to be a stopover. So it's not that he's going to South Africa, then he makes a stopover at Lesotho. Like, he's going all the way from Tanzania down to Lesotho. I mean, this is like I said, Trump has been good for China-Africa relations in ways he cannot comprehend.
Yeah,
if we go even to the garment industry, I remember seeing someone talking about how maybe China can offset some of the demand. Like, no, that's not it. I don't think China is going to go into Lesotho to say, okay, you know what, we're going to buy some of your garments. That's not it. What I think Chinese can provide, because China has a very competitive garment industry, is to help them with developing their industries, maybe at the upstream side. So things like yarn manufacturing, weaving and knitting, fiber production, because they have that kind of expertise to share with Lesotho. And if they can do that, maybe with new technologies and techniques that can reduce their production costs and then allow them to be more competitive in the global market, it's going to be more of that, in my view, than say maybe we're going to buy this and buy that. I don't think they're going to buy that. What they might do in terms of benevolence could be maybe contribute something to their aid program to support it, but I don't think it's going to be we're going to substitute with the US as a market for your products.
No, and also
yeah. So sorry, go ahead, Ovigwe.
No, and also one other area to consider is that the Chinese have been very active in Lesotho's power sector. So there's a Chinese-backed solar power construction project that's there, so 30 megawatts of electricity. At the same time, there is a hydroelectric dam that Power China is building, and it reached its first milestone in December of last year. And so I think we're going to see a lot of talk about infrastructure as well for Lesotho, which is really one of the core tenets of China's development strategy, saying that infrastructure is the key to poverty alleviation. So I expect Wang to talk about that. Cobus, last word to you on this.
I think, and this is a kind of a slightly more kind of oblique, point, but I think the visit to Lesotho may also work to send a kind of an under the radar message of support to South Africa, because of course Lesotho, like South Africa, is this giant that sits around and next to Lesotho. It wouldn't really make sense for Wang to visit South Africa in this trip, because there was such a strong Chinese presence in South Africa at the G20 last year. So they tend to kind of stagger these things. So so I think, but in a way, I think kind of coming in the wake of all of the different kind of fights between South Africa and the US, and then particularly also South Africa's strong voice on Venezuela now. South Africa can't stop itself from talking about these things. And then also, like ongoing kind of BRICS linked kind of naval exercises that also include China off the coast of South Africa. Like I think in
warships now in South African waters.
Yeah. Yes. So all of those, kind of like I think the kind of the trip to Southern Africa, as Ovigwe said, making this special trip directly to Lesotho kind of like adds this kind of additional kind of symbolic weight to Southern Africa more broadly, I think.
Okay. Well, it's going to be a very interesting visit. The visit is underway now at the time of the recording. So next week, we're going to have maybe a debrief. And Ovigwe, we'd love to check in with you to get your take on what happened, and also to kind of stay current with you on all the different things that are going to happen this year in China-Africa relations. I think, to your point, it's going to be a very active year, and Donald Trump seems to be the gift that keeps on giving to the Chinese in Africa. And I think that's an interesting point. And going back to your point, Ovigwe, that Africans seem to be eager to deal with anybody who's serious about dealing with them. And so if the Turks show up, if the Europeans show up, if the Emiratis show up, if the Chinese show up, let's talk. And the Americans don't seem that interested. Now more than half the continent is either under some kind of travel restriction to the United States. So the people-to-people ties between the United States and Africa are breaking down. And so we'll see. AGOA is still a question as to whether or not it will be renewed. It sits out there. They're talking about a new AGOA. We haven't heard from it. So anyway, Ovigwe, thank you so much for taking the time and for joining us on this first episode of the China-Africa podcast for 2026. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think the last time I was on was either the first show of the year or was a wrap-up for the previous year. So you guys tend to bring me on very...
We tend to think of you for the big picture. We think of us as the big picture. But we promise that it's not going to be a year before we have you back. So, and give our regards to everybody at Development Reimagined. That'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again next week for another episode of the China in Africa podcast, and also the China Global South podcast, which you can get on our other feed as well. We used to combine all of those shows into this China Africa feed. We don't now, because both feeds stand on their own. So if you're interested in what China is doing outside of Africa in other parts of the world, then we recommend that you check out our China Global South podcast as well. And of course, if you want to see all the great work that the CGSP team around the world is doing, and the fantastic work that Cobus is doing with the newsletter every day, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe if you want to get that in your inbox every day at 6 a.m. Washington time. Subscriptions are very affordable, and we're just so excited to see at the end of the year a big push of new subscribers joining us. And so we want to welcome everybody who's just joined our community. And don't forget, if you are a student or a teacher, you get half off. Email me, Eric at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/ or no, that's it. Just no slash. Okay, Cobus, time to wrap up this show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We'll see you next week. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening and for watching.